Hello, my MGTOW brothers, back again, and this time we're going to finish out what we've started as far as Mr. Wolff's presentation on socialism. I know it's not necessarily enjoyable for some folks, but I think he brings a perspective on this particular topic that few people actually would. And believe it or not, in the background, this debate goes on along amongst academics all the time. It's something that most folks that are average folks don't get to hear. We're usually the victims of these particular policies. But after this particular segment, this vid, I'm gonna give my opinion and my take on it in the next one. So look out for that. But I'm enjoying what's going on in the comment section. I don't necessarily agree with everybody, but that was understandable. But I like the passion and I like the discussion. It's something that needs to be brought out in the open. And for the MGTOWs viewing that have a different opinion, go ahead and jump in, because there is no right or wrong. There is no right or wrong. What I want to do is kind of pull back the veil, so we're working from knowledge instead of indoctrination. And that's what I seek to do on this channel with all my vids. I'm not always successful, because I have my biases just like anybody else. Me being a black person and me being a black person in America, I have an internal bias just like anybody else, and I have my own worldview. But I seek to change it, or at least enhance it, by knowledge. And that's what my channel is about, is to seek to change or at least enhance what we believe by knowledge. So with that, here's the last piece of the Wolff talk.
And that means we can't leave the industry in the hands of the few who have it, who own it. And we can't leave it in the hands of the few who manage it. We can't. But they're not going to go quietly. They like being on top. They like being rich. They like making the decisions, and they don't like us, not one bit. So this is going to be messy. And so most of the 19th century, these people split on the following question: how are we going to make the transition from capitalism to a egalitarian, libertarian, brotherhood-based system in which everybody is roughly equal? One side said, we're going to do that the same way capitalism came in the world. Capitalism came in, Marx's quote, dripping blood from every pore. Whether it's the civil wars in England in the 17th century, or the French Revolution in the 18th, or the American blood, violent revolution was how capitalism was brought into this world. So socialism was going to have to do that too, the revolutionary transformation. The other group said, ooh, take it easy. The people in charge are not going to like to hear any of this. And they're strong, and we're not. And they have the army, and we don't. And they'll use it. We know that. So here's a better plan. We're going to form political parties and campaign for votes. We're going to what? We're going to become parliamentarians. We're going to run for office. But whether you're a revolutionary or, by the way, what they would call the other ones, the evolutionary socialists. Very important. Biggest debate was in Germany, where these positions were worked out by the great thinkers of that time. Evolutionary Socialism, the title of a book by a man named Edward Bernstein, who was the great theorist of this way of going. And he incurred the enormous hostility of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Kautsky and others, the great thinkers of that time, who were in favor of the revolutionary path. But whether you were evolutionary or revolutionary, and here comes an important thing, Both of them thought that the way you make the transition is you capture the state, either by revolution, you overwhelm, you take over the palace, you take over the presidential building, you seize the White House, or the evolutionary one, you win the election, and you become the government. But the idea was you seize the state, and here we go now, and then you use the power of the state that you've captured, either by revolution or evolution, to make the transition. Please be aware, in that way of thinking, the state is the means to get to socialism. Capturing the state is not socialism itself. That would be a grotesque misunderstanding. You capture the state in order to then rearrange the society. Okay, so what happens? Towards the end of the 19th century, into the 20th century, that's what Marxists do. Country after country, they become more and more powerful, and they try to seize the state. The most powerful in Germany, where Edward Bernstein's evolutionary strategy wins, in a sense, the German Socialist Party, Sozialistische Partei Deutschland, SPD, says we are going to become the majority party, take the state and make the revolution then. And they become very, very powerful in the last years of the 19th century and the years before World War I. In Russia, a different party has a different method. They do electoral stuff, but then in the chaos of World War I, when capitalism in Russia is destroyed because it loses World War I, Lenin, an exile in Switzerland at the time, looks at the situation in Russia and says, this is a paraphrase, says, we don't have to wait. We don't have to do this electoral stuff. They are so weak right now, we can take it. A tiny political party, the Bolsheviks, tiny. A huge country, overwhelmingly agrarian. Bolsheviks had 6 peasants in the entire party. They were intellectuals, they were urban people, and so forth, by and large, industrial workers, not peasants, and Russia was a peasant country. But we can do it. We can actually do it. Most other socialists of the time thought Lenin was nuts and told him so. But they already thought Lenin was weird because Lenin, in the face of World War I, had said to the Russian working class, this is a war between imperialists. Workers have no business being involved in this. Don't fight. That's why he had to be in exile, because they were going to arrest him for telling the Russian people. By the way, the American socialist leader, Eugene Victor Debs, did exactly the same thing, and they put him in jail. Because he said to the American workers, you shouldn't be fighting in this. It's not a war about you. You should not be killing the workers of other countries. What the hell are you doing? You're doing the dirty work of the capitalists. They want a war, let them fight it. You shouldn't fight it. So Lenin was already strange, and now you look at even stranger. But he pulled it off. He did it. He captured the state in a revolutionary way. And all of the people who had tried to do otherwise didn't. When the dust of World War I cleared, one socialist had captured state power. Nobody else had. And the one who had used violent revolution to do it. Amazing. And gave the Soviet Union an incredible position in the world of socialists. They're the ones who had done it. They're the ones who had done it. And immediately at the end of World War I, all socialists around the world split. They split on the following basic question. If the Russians did it, and they did it in that way, that's the way to go. And the other socialists said, are you crazy? That's peculiar. That's the special conditions of Russia. That was this and that. No, don't draw that inference. They couldn't come to an agreement. So the people who thought that Russia showed the way withdrew from the socialist parties, withdrew from the socialist movement, and to underscore their view, they said, we're going to take a new name. We're going to call ourselves communists. That's where this comes from. That's where it begins. All communist parties start in 1921, 1920. They all begin in that split. The American Party, the Soviet Party, all of them. And it's a fight about what? How to make the transition from capitalism to socialism? No. How to capture the state. What should be your political path? Evolutionary with politics or revolutionary? That was the issue. Now fast forward. For 10, 15 years, 1917 to 1930, the Soviet Union, this new society, the only socialist society on the earth at that time, recovers from World War I, and to the surprise of everybody, starting with Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and all the rest, to the surprise of all of them, they survived. Remember, they had lost World War I, then there was a revolution, then there was a foreign invasion. Again, I love to remind my American audiences. In 1918, 4 nations invaded the Soviet Union to destroy the new Soviet revolutionary government: Britain, France, Japan, and the United States. 10,000 American troops landed in Russia to overthrow their government. No Russian troops ever landed in the United States to overthrow anything. But Americans have been worried blue that it might happen and can't understand why the Russians could even imagine such a thing. History, unfortunately, doesn't work that way. So they were a destroyed society. They had a civil war on top of it. They came back quickly at enormous sacrifice to the Soviet working class to rebuild that society after World War I. And they had done it by the end of the 1920s at enormous sacrifice. But the problem was the government, and this is the most important thing that we'll have time for today, the government of the Soviet Union had replaced all the private industrial corporations. The private industrialists had mostly left Russia, became exiles, went to places like Paris, London, New York. Or they became workers like everybody else. But they lost their position. The private corporate leaders, gone. The shareholders, gone. One of the first things the Russian Revolution did, close the stock market. There's no need for a stock market to buy and sell, because that stock certificate you have, tear it into strips and save on toilet tissue, because that's what it's worth. Gone. And the government came in and took over. The government appointed people to run the factories. In the aftermath of the revolution, the workers still went to work Monday to Friday. They did the same tasks they did before. But instead of doing it for a board of directors selected by the big shareholders, private capitalism, they did it for the government. What the government had done is seize the economy. But they hadn't transformed the economy, and they never did. Stalin declares in 1930-31, this is socialism. Lenin, dead by that time, would have, and probably did, turn over in his grave. No, he would have said, what we have, Lenin's phrase, is state capitalism. The state has become the capitalist. And that's important, and that's good that we did that. That's what the revolution accomplished, and that was great. But now the task was to transform, and you, Stalin, you didn't transform, you just declared that, here we go now, when the state is in charge, we got socialism. Wow. From being the means to the transition, seizing the state became the transition. From the means, it became the end. The end of the... We have socialism because the government has taken over. Even though the relationships between the government running the industry and the mass of people is not that different from the relationship of the private individuals who used to occupy those positions in relationship to the mass of the working people. But for the next, what? For the next century, till here we are. We have a mass of people, most Americans, who think that socialism has something to do with the government being in charge. No, that's not the idea. The idea was to get the government because with that power, you could then make the transition. It wouldn't be the transition. It would be the step that would allow you to make the transition. And what would the transition be? Let's go back. To reorganize enterprises, factories, offices, stores, so that they would work in the interest of the whole community because the whole community would be making the decisions. Not a small subset, the owners of the shares, the boards of directors, tiny minorities. No. That's over. The question was, did the state transform the economy? And the answer is no, they didn't. Not because they're bad and not because they're stupid or nothing like that. This is the way the history worked out. It's an understandable thing. Poor Stalin. Well, he had to go to the Russian people who had sacrificed unspeakable in their lives. And what was he going to say to them? Thank you very much. You've sacrificed unbelievably now for the last 15 years. It's 1930, since the revolution. I'm glad to announce to you all what we have achieved is state capitalism. We got a whole nother sacrifice for God knows how many years to get to. They would have ridden him out of the town on a rail. He couldn't. So he did what politicians do. He substituted the wish for the reality. We've made it. We're here. Socialism is when the government does stuff. And it's more socialism the more stuff it does. And if it does a real lot of stuff, it's communism. Everything becomes how much the government... So the French think it's socialist if the government regulates a lot and owns a few things like, I don't know, Air France. Or the government makes Gitan cigarettes, which it does. But if the government takes over everything, that's not socialism, that's communism. The measure becomes how much the government does. This is a joke on Marx. Marx never wrote an article about the state. He wasn't interested in the state. He was interested in the transformation to a new system. And one final thing, that's all we have time for today, and we'll do some more in June. One more thing. Every economic system has had both private and state forms of that system. I'll give you an example. Enslaved societies, all through the history of the world, it wasn't always that only private individuals had slavery. Sometimes states owned slaves, though you'd have to speak of private slave economic system and state slavery. The Roman state owned slaves. Give you another example, feudalism. Many of the lords, say, of French feudalism were private individuals. But the French king, the state, also had serfs. So you had private feudalism and state feudalism. The reason we both call them feudalism is because they were the same system. It's just the difference between a private individual and a state official. Capitalism's like that too. You can either be a private capitalist, an individual who owns and operates a business as an individual with no relationship to the state, then you're a private capitalist. Or the government can do that. The government can hire workers, buy raw materials and tools and equipment, manufacture something and sell it in the market. You know, like, I don't know, Amtrak, TVA, 2,500 cities in the United States have a public power. I don't know if you're aware of that. 2,500 cities in the United States produce their own electricity as a public enterprise and sell it to their own people. Holyoke, Massachusetts, about 3 hours from here, is a perfect example. For the last century, they have an electric generating plant that produces electricity, which is then sold to the people of Holyoke. The profits from that are given by the Holyoke Electric Company to the city of Holyoke, which therefore taxes its citizens less, since they don't need to tax them as much, since they're getting the profit from producing electricity. That's state capital. The state is the capitalist. The state is the investor, the state is the employer, the state is the receiver of the profit, and the state is a determiner of what is done with the profit. The state is the capitalist. Does that mean we have socialism? Yes, if you are a senator from Alabama. And I don't mean to be critical of Alabama, but although I do enjoy that, I don't mean to be it. The state is one thing. Socialism as something fundamentally different from capitalism is something else. Okay, we've run out of time. I promise you we will continue part of the major discussion on in June when we meet, the second Wednesday of June, will be a particular focus on what it would mean for a transition from capitalism to socialism once you unhook the notion of socialism from this focus on the state.